Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We know that there are so many events happening this same afternoon, so we appreciate you all taking the time. For everybody in person here now and to everybody on Zoom, thank you so much. This event is being sponsored by the Immigration Law Student Association, ILSA, as well as the Bacon Immigration and Policy program. They have a speaker series and this is part of it. And it is also being co-hosted by the Native American Law Student Association as well as the Environmental Law Student Society. And we have two speakers here. I'll go ahead and introduce them briefly, but first we want to acknowledge, as we regularly like to remind everybody on campus, our faculty, our community members, that we are on Native land, that Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized Native tribes, nations, and specifically the community of Tucson is home to the Tohono Nation as well as the Pascua-Yaqui Nation. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Lynn.
Good afternoon. I want to echo the welcome. Welcome to those of you on Zoom and those of you in the room. My name is Lynn Marcus, and I have the great fortune to direct the Community Immigration Law Placement Clinic at the Roger College of Law, and also to be one of the co-directors of the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy program. This speaker series is centerpiece of that. I want to give a special thanks to the law students from ILSA for their hard work in helping to plan, organize, and moderate the event. Tanae Pedro, Cooper Richardson, and Kate O'Donnell have been doing a lot of work. And also to Carol Lee Taylor, who has been helping with the food, the flyers, the registration, and all the logistics as always. Like the migrants, whose point we're focusing on today, we have a lot of ground to cover. We have allocated, I'm going to give you the rundown. We've got the first 30 minutes. We're going to cover basically a description, a visual cover of what's been happening on the ground, environmentally and socially. And then the next 20 minutes to the legal framework that governs the rights and protection of this displaced population, and what some ideas for change, that they have. And then the last 15 minutes, starting at 1 o'clock, will be for Q&A. So please, if you're in the room and a question occurs to you, write it down and pass it to the person at the end of the aisle. Kate will collect those. I got 10 minutes, starting at about 10 minutes to 1. And also the students will be monitoring the chat for questions, and we'll read those questions into, so that everyone on Zoom can also hear. I think that's it. That's it, except that we're going to have Naomi and Cooper introduce our speakers.
So one of our speakers today, which I'm so excited to be able to have another fellow Guatemalan Mayan relative here. She's from the Mayamam Nation in Guatemala. She's the executive director of International Mayan League and is also from the Western Highlands of Guatemala, a survivor of the internal armed conflict and genocide in Guatemala and former political refugee. She has both personal and professional experience defending Indigenous peoples' human rights in collaboration with Mayan leaders and elders in Guatemala and the US. She uses international law and organization and traditional knowledge to develop an Indigenous human rights response in the areas of immigration, land rights, and environmental protection. She also holds a master's in international public policy from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies.
Okay, we're also glad to have in person with us Blake Gentry, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation, a researcher, writer, and advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights in migration, climate change, community health, and languages. He's conducted field research in Mexico, China, Guatemala, and the United States. He was the policy advisor to the traditional governor of the Codom in Mexico and director of the Indigenous Languages Office at the Shelter in Tucson. He has conducted community projects and research in association with several University of Arizona departments and colleges, and is currently an adjunct faculty in the Mexican American Studies Department. Also has a master's degree in public policy.
Let's see, Juanita, can you say something so we can make sure you come up on your screen?
Yep, testing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Stop the share. Oh, stop the share. Oh, but then we need the,
Can she share? She can't share, can she?
no, we literally just had this. Apologies for the IT tech issue. No, I think if we. Okay, I think we're going to begin with the PowerPoint for now while we wait on Ricardo to see if he can readjust it. Juanita, if you can begin with your PowerPoint presentation while we wait for Ricardo to see why you're not popping up, but you do pop up in the Zoom.
Okay, and you can hear me, correct?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Juanita. Good afternoon, good greetings from Piscataway Nation Territory, also known as Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And I want to give particular thanks to the organizers of this important conversation, to the Bacon Immigration Law and Policy Program, the Immigration Law Students Association, and all of really hard work that's gone into this presentation. If we could go to the first slide. And I'm sorry, if we can go to the next slide. For my presentation, I really wanted to focus on bringing the political and legal consequences of policies and how they're connected with climate change, particularly for Indigenous peoples. I also wanted to focus on bringing testimonies from Guatemala, from Ishimuleo, of the current context that's affecting our peoples, our communities, our lands and territories at this time. As the International Mayan League, we're the only Maya woman youth-led organization in the United States. And our particular connection with displacement is that Maya refugees were the founding members of our organization. So we know firsthand the consequences of war, of genocide, of policies that erase our existence, that have been historically racist and discriminatory. And therefore, we continue to look at how these factors link into displacement, migration, and from Indigenous human rights framework. So really much analysis has gone from an Indigenous perspective on the various eras or the historical background of displacement particular to Indigenous peoples. And as many Maya leaders, including folks from CPO, from the Mum Nation, from Ixil people, and Maya academics like Gio Butts, we have here 4 eras of displacement, starting from the invasion in 1524, and then going into the liberal reform or redistribution of our lands to a foreign elite, and then looking at the genocide and the war, which is one that I have personal connection with. And then, of course, the 4th displacement that we're going to focus on in this presentation, the imposition of development, transnational corporations in our lands and territory. Our displacement is not new. It is not a cycle of 10 years or 50 years. Rather, it spans more than 500 years. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I really wanted to focus on the current context of this 4th era of displacement and climate change, and looking at This map, you see particularly mining concessions. As of 2020, there are 300 exploitation licenses and 22 exploration licenses in Guatemala. This has a particular and disproportionate impact to Indigenous peoples because we are the majority in our lands and territories. We are 22 distinct Maya nations, also Xinca and Garifuna peoples. And so when you look at this map, you see the imposition of mega projects all over our lands and territories. And as we see here in the quote, colonization, both historical and ongoing, is continuation in the dispossession of our lands and territories. I also want to focus on the fact that in addition to hydroelectric dams, we're also looking at, mining licenses, we're also looking at hydroelectric dams. And currently there are 64 projects in different phases in Guatemala. And I bring this up because oftentimes hydroelectric dams projects are touted as green and renewable energies as part of the climate change solutions. But as you'll hear later on in the presentation, that really is not the case. We can go to the next slide, please.
Oh, wait.
If we could, thank you.
Okay.
And we wanted to go ahead as an organization that is composed of diverse Indigenous peoples who is working directly with Indigenous migrants in the so-called US. We wanted to have more updated information as to why so many people of our communities, of our nations, are coming in such large numbers, particularly the Maya Kekchi Nation. And so in October of this year, just last month, we went and did a fact-finding mission to meet with community leaders and get firsthand accounts of what's happening on the ground. This is a photo of Agua Dulce community. Families that are living in this community are living in this community post evictions. In this community, we took testimony that there are more than 50 arrest warrants of community leaders who have been defending their lands and territories. The living conditions that we saw are deplorable. The housing constructions are pretty much shacks built up as makeshift encampments. And there is tremendous trauma and fear in the community because of the disproportionate level of violence that has occurred during the process of evictions. Again, conflicts around lands and territories, as is said in the statement behind this community leaders, detailing that they're not invaders and they're reclaiming the lands that are ancestrally theirs. We can go to the next slide, please. And in this photo, we see Ana, who is a Maya Kekchi leader, who is a victim of violent evictions that happened in Chicoyu and Alta Verapaz just in August of 2022. And in this particular evictions, 58 families were affected, were displaced, approximately 200 people, including at least 50 children and elders. There was large contingents of military forces, of the national police. And really, when we spoke with Ana, these were her words that, you know, she was saying that we're just defending what is ours, to maintain it with our peoples, to make sure that it's not lost. But when we do it, we're accused that we're stealing the lands. And so I know I'm not talking directly about climate change per se in terms of the vulnerabilities and the impacts, but all of this is very much connected with climate change, because at the heart of the climate change issue for Indigenous people is land rights and collective land rights and human rights. If we can go to the next slide, please. And in this particular slide, we look at the proposed Shalala Dam, which is slated to be constructed on the Chicxoy River It would affect more than 50 communities directly, many more communities indirectly who need the river for survival, for livelihood, for transportation. And so instead of me talking about what this impact looks like in the community, I'd like to go ahead and share the video of some of the testimony that we took that allows us to have our communities directly share what's happening and what they're seeing and living on a daily basis. So if we could go to the video, please.
La situación que vive actualmente el pueblo quechí en el municipio del Estorizabal es increíble. La inmigración, muchas hermanas y hermanos han tenido que salir de sus casas, salir de su comunidad, y últimamente en Alta Verapaz y especialmente de la zona del Polo Chico hasta el municipio del Estorizabal, muchas familias ya se encuentran en Estados Unidos. Es triste pues porque en realidad hay un proceso muy duro en lo que la familia se enfrenta a este desplazamiento forzoso. La situación preocupante para el pueblo quechí también es el cambio climático. No solamente está afectando lo que es, como decía, el cambio climático que viene, sino que también estas industrias extractivas contribuyen a lo que pasa, ¿no? Entonces la minería a cielo abierto y también como por ejemplo el monocultivo, que es otra forma de poder hacerle daño a las comunidades en desviar ríos, y esto en realidad el gobierno no le interesa el daño al medio ambiente, le interesa más la inversión, le interesa más el dinero, pero no le interesa la vida humana.
Soy el coordinador de la Asociación de Comunidades para el Desarrollo, Defensa de la Tierra y los Recursos Naturales, ACODET. Que así se llama, la asociación de las comunidades que estamos resistiendo ante la implementación de la hidroeléctrica Xalalá acá en la región norte de Guatemala. Entonces, actualmente pues llevamos 15 años de lucha, resistiendo. El proyecto Xalalá, ellos pretenden construirlo en la confluencia de dos ríos, donde desemboca el río Copón y el río Chixoy, que dividen a 3 municipios, 2 municipios del departamento de Quiché. Estamos hablando de Ixcán y Uspantán, y un municipio del departamento de Alta Verapaz, que es Cobán. El proyecto Xalalá es un proyecto que no es descartado en los planes del gobierno. Este proyecto hidroeléctrico, si se llegara a construirse, así como lo pretenden ellos hacer, la han catalogado como la segunda más grande en Guatemala después de Chixoy. Es un proyecto que viene a afectar a más de 50 comunidades directamente. Sí, directamente, aparte de las comunidades que van a ser afectadas indirectamente. En estas áreas está totalmente habitado por comunidades quechíes y MAM, que es la comunidad de Copalá La Esperanza, que es una comunidad multilingüe, y las demás comunidades son puramente gente que habla el idioma y la cultura quechí. En un momento el gobierno de Guatemala declaró incierto estas áreas. Ellos decían que no hay gente habitando ahí, puros animales hay, puro bosque, y cuando en realidad sí, estas áreas están habitadas. Y la hidroeléctrica tiene una capacidad de generar 181 megavatios, causaría una inundación de 52 kilómetros cuadrados. Entonces es bastante grande el daño que provocaría esta hidroeléctrica. Toda la energía que produce Guatemala no es para la población guatemalteca, sino que es para utilizar el negocio. Ellos lo venden a otros países. Y los más afectados somos las comunidades. Y nunca hay un resarcimiento hacia las comunidades que son afectados, que son desalojados, que son desplazados.
han contribuido a este cambio climático, las agresiones, como por ejemplo las represas, las hidroeléctricas, que pues no solamente desvían los ríos para poder tener bastante agua y generar la energía eléctrica, no solamente dejar a varias comunidades sin energía, sino que cuando ellos abren y destapan y envían a otro río toda esa agua que ellos acumulan, afectan a muchas comunidades, desde Alta Verapaz, incluso desde Huehuetenango, Alta Verapaz hasta Petén, y ahí hay muchas comunidades, pierden no solamente cosas materiales, incluso también pérdidas de vida, también cultivos.
Está también la amenaza de la hidroeléctrica Chixoy, ¿verdad? Y entonces cuando son temporadas lluviosas, cuando llueve mucho, ¿qué hace el INDE y las empresas? Ellos abren las compuertas de la hidroeléctrica. Entonces todo el agua, el agua almacenada, viene abajo.
Las comunidades se están recuperando no solamente de una situación del tema del COVID, luego viene ETA y OTA, en donde ya no es fácil, digamos, para ellos tener esa tierra fértil, sino que ahora cuentan con tierra arenosa y que ya no se puede sembrar.
El gobierno siempre ha dicho, y las empresas, que las hidroeléctricas son energías limpias. Ellos manejan ese dicho, pero nunca decían que las grandes hidroeléctricas causan sequías, alteración en el caudal de los ríos, la pérdida de la flora y la fauna, el desplazamiento de especies nativas, el desplazamiento de animales, y sobre todo, y lo más triste, es que las comunidades son desalojadas y pierden sus tierras, ¿verdad? La lucha de ACODET ha sido de manera pacífica. Lo que hemos buscado es el diálogo. No se le ha hecho ningún tipo de daño a cualquier funcionario público ni personal del gobierno. No es que las comunidades de ACODET estamos en contra del desarrollo. El rechazo y la lucha de las comunidades de ACODET es en contra de esta política energética que el gobierno maneja en Guatemala.
Thank you. And so I think the video clearly demonstrates the connection between imposed development and really looking at the structural racism that has permeated through legacies of colonization and the different policies that affect Indigenous peoples. And so really what we're seeing now within forced migration of Indigenous peoples, when you live in a majority Indigenous nation with multiple Indigenous peoples, cultures, traditions, and you're looking at just an alarming number of projects all throughout our lands and territories, you're going to see large-scale displacement of Indigenous peoples. However, the key human rights violations that continue to impact our people, such as not recognizing us as Indigenous peoples, violating our right of self-determination, of sovereignty, those are still pieces of the rights that we see are impacted throughout our migration journey. And I know I'm on time, so I will just end that in our recent work here on the northern side of the borders here in the United States, we have documentation that all 22 Indigenous peoples are currently migrating. We have the data points, and you'll hear more from Blake and his presentation. And so really, it's not a situation of one nation, one people, one family. It's a massive migration, forced migration flow that is not being recognized, that is not being adequately addressed. And the human rights of our peoples and communities are being violated in our countries of origin, within the immigration process, and then during resettlement. So thank you so much, and I will end my presentation here.
Good afternoon, Blake, and it's good to be here. Thank you, Juanita, for giving us a very thorough explanation of the underbelly of underdevelopment, displacement, and dispossession of indigenous peoples in Guatemala. I'm going to be looking today, next slide, please, at three things in this segment. First, climate change disparities in the dry corridor of Central America, and then migration routes and indigenous peoples and migration. And in the second and third section, you're going to go kind of fast, so hold on to your seat. Next slide. This is a statement about the overall climate trend. I'm going to spend some time on the science of climate data to explain what will be necessary for those who become attorneys who want to try to defend the rights of people to migrate because they've been forced because of climate change impacts to save their lives and save their families' lives and their communities. So next slide. What we're going to think about here is that in order to predict and be able to take adaptive measures, if the government of Guatemala was up to the task for USAID, how are you going to help people that you would know are going to be impacted by climate change because you know what the climate is? So there is particular problems with the situation in terms of climate data from Central America. There's research done here at this university by various peoples. There was a conference held here over a year ago, which data was presented, some of it by the Mayan League, which will be coming up in a second. But what I want to say is that this graph shows the spread and the timing of rainfall onset of nearly a month delay in adjacent areas of the local geographies. You see them in yellow and blue, right? The yellowish ones being more drought, less rain or no rain onset, and the blue ones where onset happens. So you have a varied pattern of when rain begins in the rainy season. And then there's the curious white areas, and those white areas mean that we have no data. So better climate data, which could differentiate between precipitation patterns across Central America and within it, is very incomplete. And this is problematic. It is incomplete due to the lack of the reporting stations that over time would have been able to collect that data in which longer term predictions could be made. Next slide, please. And of course, I'll say while she's doing that, these have impacts. This extremely varied precipitation record has impacts for both drought and flooding. So in this case, how has the summer drought come about? It's partly because of a weak convection, that process, which occurs in the Western Pacific. If you think China, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia, that's the Western Pacific. On the Eastern Pacific coast, where we have California and the Gulf of California, that Pacific coast system next to Guatemala is where this impacts what's going on in Guatemala, and particularly Guatemala, but also the whole Central American region. However, it's Atlantic coast hurricanes on the other side of the peninsula, or the isthmus rather, of Central America that hit Central America that we hear about. What we don't hear about is this inconsistent pattern and what's happening over the long term. Usually in the media, what we get is the dramatic, not the consistent. So this slide, next slide, please. Yes. This slide shows you a little more clearly. You can compare rainfall for here. We live in a desert area. If you're on the Gulf Coast, it's from 3 inches up here, and the Arizona Highlands, 20 inches, US average being 30. There, it's a semi-tropical area, most of this area, so you would expect much more. They get less than 59 inches, and you start to have this pattern. You can see very large splotches there in Guatemala and in Honduras, less in Salvador, and then also Nicaragua. And this is the extent of where the drought area is. Next slide, please. So the predictive use of climate data is normally based on a 30-year or more data sets. This happens to be a 37-year one, downscaled. And this is what you use to understand how to create adaptive measures over time, meaning government investment in things which will help people adapt, which could be dams, or it could be retreat from areas which you know are going to perennially flood. In the Petén, which is that boot part up in the northern part of Guatemala, which is where I have worked, it's lowlands. It's been lowland flooding for centuries and thousands of years, but it's only in certain areas that happens. And so you know what happens with increased rainfall is that starts to become not predictable any longer. So you can see in the dry corridor, there's also still this problematic absence of data. And I mentioned the Guatemalan lowlands in Petén and also Western Belize. moves over to that area, and this is where there's a lot of problems with flooding, but not the only problems. Next slide, please. So this is the data that comes from Alita's shelter, collected through the intake process from 2017 to 2019. And those are the origins of people that came through the Arizona border. And these are indigenous peoples. You can then look at the map on the right and you can try to make some sense of why there is this pattern here. And you can see that it doesn't necessarily all add up. Next slide, please. Quickly, this is just a comparison of what the dry corridor was and then where it is now. On the right, it has extended itself. Some of that is also through the felling of trees. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is a normal coffee plant, but when you have excess precipitation, what can happen is that arroyo, or an infectious disease, comes in, which has been in other parts of Latin America. Next slide, and you'll see what the result is. That's how coffee plants die. Next slide. This is the migration routes. Now we're on the second point of how it is that indigenous peoples and other migrants come through Mexico to the United States. You'll see pointing to the highlands there. There's Tikal, the lowlands, or not the lowland, I'm sorry, the lowlands where Tikal is in the Petén region, and then the highlands, which is where most of the indigenous nations that Juanita was mentioning originate from. And there's two routes from the highlands. The more typical route is basically called the Atlantic route. And those arrows go through many other towns. It's just that I couldn't get them to flex the particular way in which the routes are, but those are the basic routes. You can see where they go. So central and northern Guatemalans, especially indigenous, usually go through Texas. And then the Pacific Coast route follows for those who are going to go in through Arizona or through California, with some going over to El Paso. Next, and you can go back, I'm sorry. You can see that this is overlaid with the areas of cartel, which we don't have time to talk to about today. They are the ones in control of human smuggling. This is a map that showed up before in Juanita's presentation. We are looking at it specifically for the language areas, which are a good proxy for indigenous original territory, or contemporary territory rather. These are the top 13 languages that we have clocked in 2014 to August 1, 2019. In Alitas, you can see that Mam, which is the language and people of Juanita, and many others. Mam has 5 distinct variants known as dialects. Variants. The second largest, most frequent language we see is Quiché, and Quiché is the largest Mayan language in Guatemala, and it goes on down. And we have Mixtec as number 12, which is a Mexican indigenous language, second largest one, with 52 variants coming into the United States in their language. And then Ahuacateca, which is a small Mayan language from the Western Highlands. Next slide, please. Here we have data and a different understanding of this data. We were trying to understand if there's any change or shift. You'll see that blue incorporates data for the entire period 2014 to 2019. But we had additional languages coming in 2017, which when there was an increase of folks. And out of the 7 that are there, 4 of them are from the highlands, Ahuacateca, Tepiteca, Uspantec, and 3. And then other ones coming from the other part of Guatemala, eastern Guatemala, northern Guatemala, a little bit central for Achi, and Chorti in the east, and Itzap in the north, in the Petén region. Next slide, please. This is data that came from research that the International Mayan League did at the shelter some years ago, around 2018, when we were at the monastery here for people locally. And there was a general question that was asked, and that is, what was the reason for your departure to the United States? It's very important to ask people without having a leading question when you do these kinds of surveys. And we got the typical response, 74% said, because they needed to get work. But when you break it down and options are given, well, why do you need to get work? Which is what they're going to tell the Border Patrol. Why do you need to get work? You can see there's a different breakout here on the left. Poverty, 69%. Limited access to land, 13%. Climate change, it only said 8%. Plantation agriculture, which feeds into the agro-export business, 5%, and so on. But when we had them rank the reasons, you can see that it comes back up for loss or need of work, 74%. Violence, all the forms of violence listed here, 40%. But climate change then jumps to 23%. So you can conclude from this that it's the third, perhaps, major reason why people are coming. This is similar to other findings in a report by World Food Program. Next slide. This is our data breakdown. If you look at the blue row there, that's the 14 to 17. You can see that the number of people that we did intake on, and this is a bit of a misnomer because it could have been an individual, but individuals are only 1% of the 100% that came in. 99% of the people were families. We talked to one person out of each family. That's what's registered here, not all the other family members. So it would be 4 or 5 times the total numbers. But the important part is what is the percentage of the total number of people coming in? So what we saw in 2014 to 17, that was 20%. And from 2017 to 19, it was 19.5%. You round that up, you get 20%. Americans for Immigrant Justice, an organization, legal organization, maybe you'll work for them in Dade County, Florida. They represent immigrants and specifically undocumented or unaccompanied children who are then going to Florida. They did a survey of their own clientele, and they found out that people who speak a primary language as an indigenous language was also 20%. So we can conclude that our data was very real for Arizona, but we can also conclude that it's a proxy for the whole United States border, not just Arizona. Because those organizations, that's fine, that organization gets unaccompanied children from all across the US-Mexico border, not just from Arizona. So here again, you see that slide, next slide. We're going to go quickly now through where these language speakers end up. The only way we would get this data is if we ask them, which is something the US government doesn't do. They don't ask people their language, they don't write the data down, so therefore they have no data, so therefore they're invisible and they're excluded. But in our shelter, we made it a point to do this, and it's still being done. And here you see MOM, the most frequent indigenous language coming into the United States, and you can see the pattern here. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly. Quiche, you can see how that pattern is. Next slide. Chuk, concentrated there in southern Appalachia. Next slide. Campo Bales, somewhat similar to Quiche, but some interesting variation. Next slide. The Cachiqueles, who probably are the indigenous nation from Guatemala that has migrated to the United States for the longest, is quite dispersed. Next slide. Ixil, those who were mentioned by Juanita, who suffered the most massacres in the Civil War, also quite dispersed. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, I'm sorry, I skipped the Quechis, but the Quechis are from the Alta Verapaz region, which Juanita was talking about, in the Petén region, and some from Belize. Here's Quechua. These people come from Ecuador, and the next slide are Mixtecs, and you can see they go to California. And here we have a total number of languages, including variants as languages. And next slide. You can see that they're concentrated mostly here in Florida. Actually, you'll see, we'll get more about that. And then California and Texas, and then Southern Appalachia, interestingly. Next slide. This is a study that we did from the data. We did a statistical analysis. This was headed by Joseph Watkins here at the University of Arizona. And you can see that the Phoenix, California corridor has particular languages concentrating. The scale that you use is 1 to 10. Anything 2 or higher is a significant finding. You can see the Campo Bales, like California. Next slide. Here we have Houston, the big dot, and then Dallas, the second big dot, and we have extreme concentration of Quechis there. Next slide. Then we have Florida, which has twice as many immigrants who are indigenous arriving there than any other state in the United States. And it also is quite important because it's a feeder to other places. And here we have what is for myself the most interesting pattern. It looks to be quite wild, but you can see this is Southern Appalachia. And if you know your history, you will also recognize that this is the place of the removal of the 5 tribes. And we have most prominently here Chuk and some Zapoteco Popti. Next slide. The last one is this, they call it the Megalopolis corridor. It starts in the area that Juanita lives in. Tri-state area, moves to Philly, New York, and Boston. And we have a semblance of languages which are approximate geographically in Guatemala, ending up being approximate geographically in their new place, in the diaspora. We see that for Achi, and we see that for Quiche. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, both speakers, amazing video and just the ground that both of you have covered in that time and the work behind it is incredible and super compelling. So my task is to explain in 3 minutes international and domestic refugee law. But as it relates to climate change, that's fair because as you'll see, it doesn't match up at all in terms of the protection that's given. So the United Nations Refugee Convention, there are some regional accords, but the United Nations Convention was in 1951 in the wake of the Holocaust. So it dealt with a known quantity of known composition and quantity of people who had been displaced by World War II and the Holocaust. And the definition was narrowed to those particular people, but expanded with the protocol in 1967 to cover people who met the refugee definition from anywhere, anytime. And in terms of contents, states are of the Refugee Convention, as we'll call the convention plus the protocol, states are encouraged to grant asylum to refugees, which essentially means that the people get the rights of a national in terms of all these various areas of rights. And also there is a bar for signatory nations to sending someone back, a refugee back to a country where their life or liberty would be threatened because on account of one of 5 grounds that we'll get to. Non-refoulement is that obligation, and it's also under customary international law. So the refugee definition is, as you'll see, quite narrow. It's a person who has suffered persecution or has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of these 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, particular membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So that's international refugee law in a nutshell. US refugee law, the United States signed on to that protocol 1 year later, 1969, and then changed domestic law to incorporate the refugee definition into our domestic law in 1980, and it includes the right to apply for asylum anywhere within the United States and at a port of entry, whether you present or whether you don't present, as long as you meet the refugee definition. So just a side note, many of you have heard of Title 42, which is a very old health rule statute that the Trump administration used with COVID-19 under the pretext of protecting US health to bar people from being able to come and seek asylum and expel asylum seekers either to Mexico or send them back to their countries without the opportunity to apply for asylum. Yesterday, a district court in the District of Columbia found this to be illegal, and that's an obvious victory for asylum seekers. There's a 30-day hold on that for the government to gear up and start giving people the right that they have under international domestic law to apply. But the problem is that the big protection gap, which is that starvation or other extreme hardships of any numerous kinds, if there's no specific intent to target people because of their race, political opinion, etc., is not considered to be persecution on account of one of these 5 grounds. And thus, no country offers asylum to climate migrants under the auspices of the Refugee Convention. So that's basically it, except that the United States does have an alternative statute under which people can be given a temporary protection status, and the Secretary of Homeland Security can decree that protection for nationals of certain countries who have arrived in the United States as of a certain date. And it's based on conditions, and it can include civil war, it can include famine, any number that prevent people from being able to safely return, or their home countries from being able to safely handle their return. There's about 400,000 people with TPS in the United States right now. And I think that's all I
We will move in, excuse me, into the international legal basis for Indigenous rights. And this is the area where Juanita, the Mayan League, myself and other folks who are working with it, Indigenous immigrant organizations in the United States spend a lot of time thinking about. There are three basic instruments, but before we go into them, what I want to say is it's important to understand why the rights of Indigenous identity and the right to Indigenous language is not an aspirational notion. Is it something that we should have to convince U.S. courts exists? Under international law, there have been in modern times 3 accords, which we'll go over, and these come out of this 3 distinct historical periods. It's also not a grant of a right by a state as a part of multicultural rights, which is a favorite framework for neoliberal states up and down the Americas. It's not that the origin, the scope of these rights precedes that concept, and it's a concept that has actually been very damaging in terms of understanding Indigenous rights internationally and then applying them nationally. This is being played out in many constitutional reforms in Latin America. So the first instrument is the International Labor Organization's Convention 169, which was produced by countries who supported universal workers' rights at the end of World War I as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. It represented both socialist and left demands for workers' rights. And this organization preceded the UN, was folded into the UN, and in 1989 created a convention recognizing Indigenous peoples as a special class of peoples needing legal protection. The United States is not a signatory to this, but most Latin American countries are. If you work in Indigenous rights in Mexico, every single document that you put in the public, you cite ILO 169, which I did for about 20 years. The second instrument is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, passed after 21 years. Once a committee was formed in the UN and many decades of struggle before that, but it's also part of the reforms which established the as part of those reforms, there was also the establishment of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples in the UN, which gives vital access to Indigenous peoples in the Economic and Social Council of the General Assembly, taking it away from the realm of the Human Rights Commission, which is also extremely political, or is usually very political. The UNDIP lays out major provisions for territorial, religious, social, economic, and cultural rights. It recognizes the rights of Indigenous across borders where Indigenous have been divided by nation states, for example, the Yato. And key to that is Article 36. The third convention was hammered out in the OAS after these other two as a means to address grievances that were coming into the International Court because of armed rebellions in Abya, Latin America, and movements of Indigenous peoples through the continent, which brought legal cases into the court. Using general human rights instruments, they were arguing their cases and advocating for inclusion of these rights written in the other two instruments, not covered, but they wanted the rights that weren't being covered under UNDRIP, such as the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation, initial contact, like those in the Amazonian part of Brazil, and Indigenous peoples impacted by armed conflict, which would be a whole semester. It strengthens UNDRIP's provisions concerning Indigenous peoples' treaty rights, which we have in the United States, which are particularly relevant in the Americas, and many Indigenous in the hemisphere that consider, well, many Indigenous in this hemisphere consider that a major victory. It's a substantive addition to the other two international instruments, and it's especially important in the United States and for those who are trying to take cases that involve the United States to the OAS, because the United States is a signatory to this, and they are legally bound by its findings through the OAS, or the Inter-American Court. And that's pretty much it. This constitutes then the body of law that can be accessed. We don't find immigration lawyers so far bringing these arguments into the immigration or asylum cases. We would like to see the day that this happens. And I think that we all, as Indigenous peoples, understand that you have to fail many times before you have success. So we're ready to fail with you.
Okay, then you have also.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So US law has not translated really the articles of these instruments into US domestic law. In terms of immigration, what affects us mostly at the border is only at the level of executive order. Executive order, next slide, please. Executive order 13166 was put out by Bill Clinton. And what we see is that it's calling for access to federal services for those people who are limited English proficient, LEPs. And it goes beyond that, but what I want to point out is that executive order was put out by Clinton, and then Obama had Attorney General Eric Holder put out a federal letter to the agencies reminding them of their duty to implement Executive Order 13166 in 2010, 10 years later, because it hadn't been implemented. And then he sent another letter in February 17th in 2011, with 4 years left on the clock of Obama's second administration, and it also was never implemented. In June of 2021, the Biden administration issued an executive order called Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility in the Federal Workforce, which talks about limited English proficient people. It also talks about immigrants, but it does not talk about Indigenous peoples, and it does not explicitly say that Indigenous immigrants should have the right to speak their language at first contact. So I ask you, do you see a pattern here?
Thank you, Blake. We have Juanita, if you can help me switch to Juanita here.
You can just go to the next one.
You know how to get her video back?
Yeah, if she turns on her camera, Juanita, and you can,
Oh, great.
next part.
Thank you so much, Blake, for the background on this. I just wanted to go back a little bit on some of the things around Title 42, which is a huge win, and of course MPP and other policies that have had such a disproportionate negative impact on Indigenous peoples. And again, going back to some of the things that we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, which is the erasure of Indigenous peoples is a huge first barrier in addressing the particular needs and rights that Indigenous peoples hold in different international human rights instruments. If we look at the Declaration, et cetera, when what we have seen, and we see the cases, particularly cases that you may be familiar with of the children at the border who died between 2018 2019. The 6 high-profile cases that were all over the news were actually Maya children, but you did not see that, you did not hear that in the dominant narrative that was coming from mainstream media. And so what these particular horrific situations allude to us is that their identity was not addressed, their language needs were not met, and they died by medical negligence under the custody of the US government. And in the case of Claudia Patricia Gomez, we often refer to her as a case of missing and murdered Indigenous women because she was murdered by Customs and Border Patrol agents. And so it really calls for us to rethink how our peoples are being treated when they are forcibly displaced and then enter into the US-Mexico region. If we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I guess this is Blake, sorry, and then I'll pop back in.
Part of the instrument of DRIP calls for free, informed, and prior consent. This is when established state governments want to speak with Indigenous peoples and work out how rights are going to be implemented. And what we have found in the United States government from Obama's administration forward, I guess we could skip over the Trump administration in this term, is that they sometimes seek to contact Indigenous organizations and peoples to understand what's going on. And what they'd like to engage in is called dialogue, but not to do not follow what is required with free, informed, and prior consent. We had an experience with this with the White House task force on the reunification of families separated by force by the prior administration, Trump. The areas where this has been an issue has been in public health, COVID coverage, where Indigenous peoples now in the United States who are migrants are not recognized or understood because they don't have these maps, they don't pay any attention, and they're identifying them as Latino, Spanish-speaking populations. And when they use their COVID messaging, it doesn't reach people because that's not their first language. Another area is the entire immigration system, DOJ, EOIR, which runs the courts, DHS agency, CBP, USCIS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and Department of State and OR, which are in charge of the unaccompanied minors who are supposed to, who are in their shelters. These are the areas where there should be engagement and there should be a much more formal recognition of this international law, and there isn't recognition, and so we run into conflicts. And who are the folks working in this area? The Mayan League, the National Council of Indigenous Peoples in the Diaspora, which Mayan League helped start, National Council of NCCAI, which is a lobbying organization of tribes in the states, Cherokee Nation passed the same resolutions, NCCAI, and other indigenous NGOs. In the border area, the problem that we have is what was she was alluding to, and that is that first contact happens with Border Patrol, green uniformed armed officers who were usually trained in the military in combat before they became Border Patrol agents. And the public discourse around the Border Patrol is that administrations like the Biden administration would like to call them a police force, when in reality, as the former Inspector General of Border Patrol described them, is they really work as a paramilitary organization, meaning they are a paramilitary organization under the US government, and that's their training. And this is problematic. Those of us on the border who've been trying to work on this include the language office that was started at Elita Shelter, Indigenous Alliance Without Borders, COMPI, and other affiliates, and support from the interior on this particular stance. Next slide. Yeah.
So is this a point where I think we're at the
advocacy. Okay, you're back on, Juanita, for the advocacy point section.
Great, thank you. So based on our work as the International Mayan League, we've been one of the few organizations that has been since about 2017-18, really looking at system-wide approach in terms of how to address the needs and the our peoples, because we are part of our peoples. We come from histories and our own personal stories of displacement. And so one of the, as Blake shared, our research that we did as a Maya woman-led delegation at Casalitas, we came out with a full report that we submitted to the United Nations, and I'm sure we can have that report circulated. But one of the key recommendations that we had at the UN level was really sort of creating an Indigenous advisory group that would allow for a more comprehensive approach of analysis and creating strategies that would address the needs and rights of Indigenous peoples. But as we've now been working within the resettlement pattern of families, unaccompanied minors, family separation, we're seeing that this initial recommendation that we made in about 2018-19 can still be used at the local, regional, and national level. So we really do think that supporting or co-creation of Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group within your work, within the systems that you work with, helps create solutions that are fully grounded and supported by the actual impacted communities. As Blake has talked about, and we have seen this in our own work as well, we're not appearing in data in any statistical disaggregated data, which means that we're classified as Latino or Hispanic Latinx, or this confusing category of Indigenous Latinx, where in reality we're Native American. We're Indigenous peoples from Native nations throughout Abya Yala. So we really need to look at the way the forms are created in a matter that is ethical, and to work with Indigenous researchers in this data collection process. This only helps, especially if you, as students, starting to go into the legal field, really looking at how you're also going to approach asylum cases and working with your clients. We're seeing the biggest barrier that comes out from service providers, legal providers, schools, is around language, culture, and resources. And so we really see the necessity to hire Indigenous staff to make sure that this gap is addressed, and to budget accordingly for that hiring process, as well as ensuring that there are Indigenous language interpreters who are trained and who can bridge this language gap. And then in terms of the root drivers of forced migration, as we know, the Biden administration and many other administrations prior have created, the Plan de prosperidad. They have now their root cause strategy under the Biden administration, which does not address really land rights issues, does not address sovereignty and self-determination rights of Indigenous peoples, collective rights. It only addresses surface things like corruption, bringing finance to microloans. But these are not structural changes that need to happen, as you heard through the video and the testimonies on the ground. So ensuring that we have power and voice in decisions that impact us, and we clearly hear this resonated right now in the United Nations Climate Change Conference with multiple Indigenous peoples globally reiterating the human rights framework, reiterating Indigenous rights within climate change discussion. And then lastly, and this is the most simple one, but I think the hardest one from our experience, is that you need to take time to listen and learn from Indigenous peoples themselves and uplift Indigenous-led solutions, because our people are experts in what's happening to us in our communities and have been developing Indigenous-led processes. And so I would just leave that as some of the key things that we see across the board at local, regional, and national and international level are some of the recommendations, and happy to share other policy documents that as an organization we have created. Thank you so much.
Look a little bit, go back to the previous. Okay, very quickly, I want to point out a report that came out. It's actually a policy statement. There's a string of policy statements that have led to this, which you didn't have to read, but I did. And basically, it looks like in this paragraph, if you're reading this document, which is over 40 pages, it says the United States is going to be to model the practice and discuss openly managing migration humanely for those who are impacted by climate, and that they should be collaborating with other governments to address these challenges. That all sounds very good. Go to the next slide. You read a little bit further into it and you find out how this is going to happen, this imagined way in which the United States is going to help deal with climate migration, because this document is very clearly saying climate migration is a reality and it's something that we're going to have to prepare for. Prior to this document, there have been quadrennial reports coming out of the Department of Defense who have stated very consistently the largest challenge to the U.S. armed forces globally is climate change. Not China, not Russia, but climate change. And what we see here in the highlighted area or the bolded area, which I put, this part says middle income countries with fewer resources will become relatively more attractive alternative destinations. What that means is the United States does not intend to allow climate migrants into the United States, but to hold them to a series of policies, just like metering, MPP, and Title 42 in Mexico, and not allow them to come into the United States. This is language that has come out of national security doctrine of the United States and the DoD, and now it's being put into a policy statement here. You can look it up yourself, but I wanted to point that out before we get into some of the.
Thank you so much, once again, for all this really important information. I know that we have less than 15 minutes and we do have a couple of Q&A. I just wanted to check real quick if there's any on Zoom. No, okay, we are not. Okay, so I'm just going to begin with some of the ones that came up, and I think, Juanita, you had a question about Title 42. Was that answered? I know he kind of spoke up.
Basically, I happened to write that question just as you were talking about it, Professor Lynn, but can you expand about it? Because usually you hear about people being kept in Mexico, but mostly you hear about Latino people. You don't hear about Indigenous people. So can you elaborate more about Indigenous people being excluded by Title 42?
Juanita, did you hear that, or would you like for me to repeat it? I'll repeat it for any folks on the Zoom who may not have heard it. Basically, the question is, how has Title 42 have impacted Indigenous communities? Because normally what we hear in the media and the news is that there has been a larger impact on the Latinx immigrants coming through the border. But I don't know if one of you would like to take that one, and then we can move to the next question.
I just want to say before you answer, Blake, is that there have been 2 million expulsions under Title 42 overall.
Title 42 is a blunt instrument issued by the White House, but used very specifically with White House corresponding instructions by the Border Patrol. And what they did is the following. You have to go back to the Trump administration and remember there were 4 bilateral agreements, which basically said you will keep immigrants in your country, Mexico, and Central America, and Northern Triangle countries, and you will not allow them coming into the United States. That's what those bilateral agreements came down to. Biden canceled the bilateral agreements and then had a negotiation with Mexico and imposed similar conditions without the bilateral agreements. That's Title 42 in the way that it was used. It's supposed to be a COVID testing thing that people come from countries that's going to expose to us. I worked in a shelter where 200-300 people a day, we tested them for COVID. They were already in the United States. They were already issued their legal papers to travel further into the United States, and they were tested in our shelter. So the idea that this is the issue is not correct. The other thing is the Central Americans were systematically blocked from coming in. It's not about Latinx or Indigenous, it's Central Americans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, and El Salvadorans were systematically denied. Those who didn't go to ports of entry, who tried to cross in other places, were expelled 2 or 3 times, and the cartel adjusted to that, by the way, in their business model. Who was let in by the truckloads were Venezuelans and Brazilians. More problematic for the administration were Cubans and Haitians, depending on what was going on in the press. Very much what they've been using Title 42 is to favor or not favor some countries' immigrants according to US foreign policy.
Would you like to elaborate on that, Juanita, or I think
Sure. So I went ahead and it can be a resource for you all. We did go ahead and put in a report to during the comment section on the interim final rule, really detailing again across the board, whether it's Title 42 or what was MPP or any other type of immigration policies, the human rights violations that are occurring are the same across the board. There is erasure of our identities. There is a lack of data. There is the lack of opportunity to fully use any process or due process because people cannot adequately communicate in first point of contact and then throughout the entire immigration process. So what we saw with Title 42 is that throughout the whole total process, and I have the numbers here from 2020 through 2022, and it's in the link that I shared. We had over 200,000 expulsions of people from Guatemala. But what we're not seeing is the complete story within that data, because neither US side tracks based on our indigeneity, and on Guatemala side, that data is not tracked. So all you're seeing are Guatemalan nationals. You're not seeing that there's probably a disproportionate number of expulsions in those numbers that are indigenous peoples. And so we have charts in this document. It's very short. It's only like 6-page document. But really expressing our concern that the continued types of violations that are being met by indigenous peoples are similar in terms of the language gap, the violation of our right to exist and self-identify as an indigenous person, and then to have all of the rights that stem from our right of existence are then hindered, and due process is denied in the process for seeking any sort of legal recourse.
Thank you. Our next question is about the effects of climate change and how they're on their way. The first, it's a 2-part question. First, they ask, how do we prepare for climate refugees? And second, where will they most likely go? Who would like to go first? Juanita, maybe? Or-
Sure, I can go first. So again, I think that really as individually and as societies, we need to just rethink the bottom line in terms of how humanity is overexploiting our earth, this planet, destroying our home. But the disproportionate impact, as you heard in the videos, are really indigenous peoples and people who are vulnerable and in marginalized communities. And so really, again, and this has been stated numerous times in the climate change conferences and reports that have come out from the Special Rapporteur, one of the key solutions to climate change or for climate change mitigation is asserting that Indigenous peoples have their collective rights to their lands, territories, and natural goods of the earth. This has already been written in various reports. Indigenous peoples and our stewardship over our lands and territories has made it so that 85% of the world's biodiversity is in our lands and territories. It means we're doing something right in protecting our environment, protecting our home, our waters, our lands, our flora, our fauna. But it also places us at risk at disproportionate extractive industry and forced development, as you heard from the videos. And so really it's a changing in the way in which policies, governments are responding. I mean, we're hearing how affected countries are the ones that are least heard right now in these climate change negotiations. And then this is more disproportionate for Indigenous peoples. But we're coming. And as we've seen in the maps that Blake showed, and as we know as an organization, particularly from a Maya perspective, our peoples are going all over the United States and no one is prepared. And we know this because the schools are calling us, clinics are calling us, law firms are calling us, and there is no cultural awareness, there's no language resources. And those that have been developing and saying that this is a crisis are the ones who are least funded. We're a very, very small organization. And so that's part of, there's a disproportionate level of crisis versus the folks who can respond adequately from a place of culture, language, historical knowledge, and cosmovision. And so it really is critical that we start thinking of what these long-term solutions look like in terms of rethinking and redesigning our response process and ensuring that those, again, who are cultural experts and experts in our communities are part of that design process, which is why the first recommendation I put on there is working with Indigenous peoples and creating a tangible structure that allows for full and effective participation to develop solutions to address what's occurring throughout all of the United States.
I think the state of the world is, as you probably have seen, a bit messed up. I agree with Juanita. The care of Mother Earth has not come to fruition in front of Indigenous people. And you're in a crisis, in a crisis, in a crisis. The problem for now for legal rights for climate migrants is they have no legal rights. So where do we start? We might imagine we start in the United States. If you go there, and the United States will be the leader, as that document pretended to propose. Or it might be that we need an international convention for climate migrants. And there is now a regional agreement between states, multilateral. It started in Southern Africa, and now it has included Eastern African states. It's called the Kampala Agreement. I would suggest you look it up. That is the beginning of what might become a more possible model for an international convention. But part of that, what's needed is that we need a protocol specifically for how to deal with climate refugees or climate migrants. We need an international convention because we need the states to recognize this outside of reducing their carbon, that the impacts and the need for adaptation is upon us. And we need protocols for the protection of those people. We need it both in the United States and we need it internationally because we have people fleeing places, I think it's called Florida, where hurricanes come, and the Southeast United States, we have long-term drought in this area and so on and so forth. So I'm saying that, well, we need to start also imagining a bigger picture there, and Indigenous peoples need to be a part of that picture.
Thank you. We're right on time. Most people who need to leave at this point, you're welcome to do that. Blake is going to be available here to go in the courtyard and answer more questions. Juanita, I'm sorry, I wish you could come in the courtyard. Thank you so much to our two speakers and again to the law students. We just had so much information and compelling information and suggestions for our students to work on as we go forward. So thank you very, very much.